ለመማር ወደ ትምህርት ተቋም መሄድ ግድ አይደለም።
ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
ራሳችሁን ከኮሮና ቫይረስ ወረርሽኝ እየጠበቃችሁ በቤታችሁ ወይም በተመቻችሁ ቦታ
በኢንተርኔት አማካኝነት በኦንላይን ትምህርታችሁን መከታተል ይቻላል።
ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና
ከእንግሊዙ ኢንስቲትዩት ኦፍ ኮመርሻል ማኔጅመንት ICM ጋር በመተባበር የሚሰጡ ትምህርቶችን ተከታትላችሁ በ6 ወር ጊዜ በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ተቀባይነት ያለውን የስልጠና ማስረጃ ባለቤት መሆን ይቻላል።
ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና ባገኘንባቸው የፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን እና የሆስተስ ስልጠናም በምዝገባ ላይ ነን።
ጥያቄና መልስ፣ የክፍል ስራዎች ብሎም ፈተና መፈተን ክፍል ውስጥ እንዳላችሁ አይነት
ልምድ ባላቸው መምህራን እየተማራችሁ
በኦንላይን ባላችሁበት ቦታ።
አድራሻ ከ22 ማዞሪያ ወደ ሾላ ገበያ በሚወስደው መንገድ 150 ሜትር ገባ ብሎ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ
ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
If you remember, last week we have seen about the evolution of money and the various classification of money in terms of metallic, in terms of paper, and in terms of credit money. We have also seen the introductory section that classifies the types of money as M1, M2, M3. We also have M4 classification. Given this previous session, in today's session, we are going to see 3 critical topics. One is, how do people or institutions as an individual or as a firm determine the choice of assets? The second point we are going to see today is about the determinants of money demand. What determines the choice to have money? And then we will see the elasticity of money demand, meaning how far these determinants are responsive for the money demand. Therefore, at the end of this session, you could be able to understand the portfolio or the choice for assets. Second, you could also understand the determinants of money demand, price, income, inflation, and liquidity of the asset alternatives, and how these factors determine the money demand, meaning what is the direction of relationship between these factors and that of the money demand. We will see that. The other is, how elastic are these factors for the money demand. We will see the elasticity of money demand with reference to the determinants of the money demand. Therefore, the first point is the portfolio allocation and the demand for assets. Let me ask you a question. How do you allocate your wealth among the various assets? Sometimes you may prefer to have money, right? Sometimes you may prefer to have bonds, and sometimes you don't need to have the liquid asset, and you would like to choose to have a car. Therefore, the question is, how do you allocate your wealth among the various assets? Here in monetary economics, it has its own theoretical justification for the choice of assets by individuals or institutions or in the country in general. And this is largely determined by the expected return among the competing assets. The expected return, for instance, for bonds, for buildings, or for a car, or for a building, as compared to the other assets. You will compare the level of return. The other is your choice among the various assets might be determined by their respective risks. And finally is the liquidity, their liquidity. Therefore, the liquidity, the degree of liquidity for these assets determines the choice of your asset. And there is a trade-off among these factors as well. Therefore, let's see each. The first is the return, meaning the rate of return. Does the asset increase its value over a period of time? For instance, if you put your money, if your choice is a money, the rate of return might be in terms of the amount of interest rate that it can earn. In another case, you might prefer to have a corporate stock. Therefore, what you do is you will compare the rate of return from the money that you have in your bank account and the rate of return that you have in the corporate stock. And the return from the corporate stock is the dividend that you get, meaning the percentage in profit from the corporate stock, plus the percentage increment in the stock price across period. Therefore, the higher the return the asset will bring, the higher the choice of that specific asset. Hence, investors or firms want the assets with highest expected return. Here the common assumption is ceteris paribus. We consider other things as equal. However, the problem is the return of these respective assets is not clearly known in advance. Therefore, what people do is they make an estimation about the future expected return of their choice of the asset. Therefore, one of the critical factors that determines portfolio choice of asset is therefore expected return. People or institutions make a comparison among the list of assets and they choose the one that provides them the highest expected return. The second is risk. Risk is still talking about the uncertainty in the assets return. Risk, for instance, in terms of change in price or inflation. People dislike risks and people prefer those assets with low risks. And in particular, those assets with low risk and with high probability of liquidity have low expected return. However, here it depends on the characteristics of the people. Some people might be risk lover, some people might be risk averse, and the others might be risk neutral. Therefore, the characterization of risk would have to be justified with reference to the behavior of people in terms of risk neutrality, risk lover, or being risk averse. However, the general theory establishes that the higher the risk, the higher the risk, the lower the choice of that specific asset. Therefore, risk is the second factor that determines the portfolio choice of assets. Third is liquidity. Liquidity is how easy it is or how quick it is converted to liquid money. And you know that money is the liquidest one. However, some assets like houses, automobiles are not as liquid as money itself. Therefore, individuals prefer the asset that can be easily converted into liquid money. And the liquidity of assets can be hierarchically demonstrated. The liquidest is money itself. Next to that, the less liquid is stocks and bonds. And as compared to stocks and bonds, those as automobiles and houses are illiquid. And in general, investors prefer assets that can be easily converted into liquidity. Therefore, the first station justifies how people or firms make a choice among the given assets. For instance, money itself, land, building, automobiles, checks. Therefore, these that are explained previously determines the portfolio choice of money, assets in general. Now, let's be specific to the case of money. The case of money. The one that we have seen previously is generally for assets. What determines the portfolio choice of assets in general? We have seen that. Now let's be specific. Let's pick out money. People want to have as much money as possible, right? I hope you remember your introduction to economics 101 that explains about the establishment of economics itself, where people are aspiring to have unlimited want, and in the other wing we have limited or scarce resources. The demand for money here does not mean how much money people would like to have, the best of all worlds. Rather, it also comprises of to have that money within the given constraints. Therefore, the choice to have money is subject to some given constraints. And money demand might be explained at an individual level, at firms level, and even the entire economy at macroeconomic level. Now let's see each. First is the individual demand for money. If you want to have, in a specific moment, if you want to have, for instance, liquid money, there is a possibility of converting your wealth into the form of money itself. Therefore, if you want to hold more wealth in the form of money, meaning converting wealth into the money, we must hold less wealth in other forms. Meaning, if you want to have more money in your bank account, what you can do is you can convert, or you can sell your car and convert to the most liquid asset, that is money itself. You may sell your house and put it in terms of money. Therefore, you are making a choice between the different forms of wealth itself. And why do people want to hold some of their wealth in the form of money? Why we were individuals? We are talking as an individual. Why do individuals want to hold their wealth in the form of money? That is right, because money is a means of payment, and other forms of the wealth cannot be directly used for payment or for purchase or for transaction by itself. However, the other forms of wealth might provide you a financial return. For instance, when you hold money, you bear an opportunity cost, right? Therefore, the opportunity cost is the interest that you would have to earn it by holding other assets instead. Therefore, the decision of individuals to hold the money, for instance, let's consider the two forms of assets, for instance, money and that of bonds. Money, people might aspire to have money, which they can use it as a means of payment. But as far as they use it, and as far as it is not saved in the bank, it will not earn interest, right? However, if you are using your money by converting into bonds, bonds can bring you interest. But at the same time, bonds cannot be used as a means of settling payments. Therefore, the individuals might choose to put or to use their wealth into different mode of assets depending on their interest. The question is, if they are using their money as a means of payment, how much money will individual decide to hold in his pocket, for instance? It is largely established in the literature as the price level, the real income, and the interest rate, meaning the opportunity cost of the money, answers this question. Therefore, the predicting factors for the amount of money that an individual decides to hold might be dependent upon the price level, the real income, as well as the interest rate in the economy. We will see each factor later. Now we have seen the demand for money at an individual level. Next is the demand for money at business level. Some businesses or firms store or keep some currency in their cash registers, or some firms may generally keep funds in checking accounts, and they would have to decide the amount of money that they could put in the cash register in terms of currency and the other alternative assets. Therefore, there is a choice to have either currency in their cash register or to use that money in terms of the other form of assets. The question here is still how much money are they aspired to hold. One factor is the price level and the real income as well, which is also the same as the factor that determines the demand for individuals. They want to hold more money when real income is higher. We will see each factor next as well. The other is, now we are moving to the economy-wide level. The economy-wide demand for money. We know that there is a specified amount of wealth in the economy, in the entire economy, at a specific time, and this wealth might be, for the sake of simplicity, let's consider two forms as money and bonds. And the demand for money in the economy is dependent upon the price level, the real income, and the interest rate itself. And these factors are the same with the factors that determine the demand for individual. The demand for individual. For instance, if there is a rising price level, it results in increment for demand for money. When there is a rise in real income, again, it will increase the demand for money. A rise in interest rate decreases the demand for money. Ceteris paribus. Therefore, these factors are the same for the individuals as well. Okay. Now let's see each factor which affects the okay. I was admitting someone. The factors affecting the money demand, and these factors are in general affecting the demand for money at an individual level, at the firm level, as well as the country level. Therefore, you can justify with reference to the scope of the explanation. And these are the key macroeconomic variables that affects the money demand. One is the price level. Would you ask yourself, for instance, do you need more money when the price of commodities is cheap or expensive? For instance, at an individual level. የሸቀጦች ዋጋ በጣም ሲጨምር የሚያስፈልገን ገንዘብ ምን ይሆናል? because ብዙ ይሆናል because you are paying much money for a specific item. Therefore, you demand for money. If there is an increment in price level, will be high. Therefore, one of the macroeconomic variables that affect the demand for money is price level. The higher the price, the more the money you need. The more the money that the economy requires the money. The higher the price, the more the money that you need to pay for your transaction. For instance, at global scale, the prices are 10 times as high as compared to in 1935. Therefore, when prices are folding 10 times, that means you need to have a money that would have been fold 10 times as much as the money equivalent transaction that was held before the increment in price. Therefore, it is established that nominal money demand is proportional to the price level. Here, nominal is to mean it's not adjusted for a change in price or inflation. Hence, one of the factors which affects the money demand is price level. The other is real income. Real income. Do you think that who demands more money? The rich person or the poor person? Here it says real income. Real income is to mean that it is adjusted for a change in price or for inflation. It is real. And this real income is a prime determinant of the number of transactions you conduct, because this real income as well has price component, right? So your money demand will rise as your real income increases. However, you have to be conscious about the proportionality of the money demand with the change in real income. I asked you at the inception of this subtopic whether real rich persons or poor persons demand more money. Who do you think demands more money? The rich or the poor? Of course, empirical evidences are showing that money demand is not proportional to real income. For instance, your real income might be increased by 10%. Your money demand might not increase by 10%. It might be less than that. And it is largely determined by different factors as well. Therefore, real income affects the amount of demand that we have. The other is interest rate. One of the critical points that you would understand is we are talking about the causality, right? The cause and effect relationship. However, you could be conscious about the elasticity, the responsiveness. For instance, real income ጨምሮ የሰውየው የገንዘብ ፍላጎቱም የመኒ ፍላጎቱ ላይ ጨምር ይችላል። ፕራይስ ጨምሮ የገንዘብ ፍላጎቱ ላይ ጨምር ይችላል። how ጨምርም ላይ ጨምር it depends on the elasticity for a change of that specific factor. Therefore, what you do is understand the general theory of the relationship between these factors with money demand. However, this depends on the elasticity of the respective factors. Of course, we will see next. Therefore, interest rate, an increase in interest rate on non-monetary assets, for instance, decreases the demand for money. Why? When there is an increase in interest rate, people assume that they can gain more money by saving in banks. However, people compare the opportunity cost. For instance, what if they invest it somewhere else instead of saving it? As a result, they make a comparative analysis on the interest rate and the return on the non-monetary assets. Here, we are assuming the nominal interest rate. Of course, the real interest rate affects saving and investment decisions. That is, real interest rate is adjusted for a change in inflation, where R is called R. This R stands for real interest rate is equal to nominal interest rate minus the inflation, meaning real interest rate is adjusted for a change in price. There are also other factors which affects money demand. For instance, wealth. Wealth in general, this is also associated with real income as well. You can also go align with this real income. Both have the same thing. The other is payment technologies. For instance, ኤቲኤም ካርድ መኖሩ የሰዎች መኒ ዲማንድ ይቀንሳል ወይስ ይጨምራል ብላችሁ ታስባላችሁ? It said that having the accessibility of payment technologies, for instance, credit cards, ATMs, reduces money demand because it's possible to directly withdraw money with ATM, right? Therefore, it will be until you need it for transaction, the money is stored or saved in the bank. Therefore, the presence, it said that the availability or the expansion of ATMs have the possibility of reducing money demand. Therefore, technology as well matters for money demand. Now let's see. Now, I hope you get the point of linking money demand with its determinant factors. Now, we are going to drive the money demand curve with those determinant factors. For instance, what happens when something other than interest rate changes? What happens on the money demand? The curve will shift. I hope you remember the movement along the demand curve and shift of the demand curve in your microeconomics or introduction to economics for those non-economists. You have to you go and read what movement along the demand curve and what shift in demand curve mean. Therefore, let's see what happens where
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ ኤምቢኤ በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት፣ ኤምቢኤ በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ ኤምቢኤ በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ፣ ኤምቢኤ በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ፣ ኤምኤስሲ በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
graphical here. Here in the x-axis is money demand here, and in the y-axis is the interest rate. You see here as the interest rate increases, for instance, from 3% to 6%, the demand for money will reduce from 800 to 500 billion dollar or more, you can say. As opposed to this, when the interest rate decreases from 9% to 6%, the money demand, the amount of money demand decreases from 300 to 500 billion. Therefore, the left diagram is telling you the movement along the money demand curve for a change in interest rate. Okay. Now let's see the shift in the money demand curve. You see in the right side, a change in interest rate doesn't shift the demand curve. However, the shift, if it is visible for you, from M1D to M2D is as a result of other factors than interest rate. For instance, price level. When there is an increment in price level, the money demand will shift to the right, meaning it will increase. Or the other factor is income. When there is an increment in income, the money demand will shift to the right. Therefore, here, price level and income has the effect of shifting the money demand to the right side. Therefore, you have to know how and why and what. You have to justify why the price level. We have explained it in the previous slides. Why price level shifts the money demand. Why income shifts the money demand. The other is money market equilibrium. Now, if you remember, the money supply is measured using M1, M2, M3, and in some other countries, you may find out M4. And here, you have the money demand and the money supply, which is the money market equilibrium. If it is visible for you, it says MS, money supply. It is vertical and falls on 500 billion, right? And if it is vertical, it is vertical. This is to mean that the money supply is fixed. The money supply is fixed because it is managed by, in our context, the National Bank of Ethiopia. Therefore, we have a fixed amount of money supplied to the economy in Ethiopia because it is centrally managed. However, there is a money demand. Money demand, therefore, would have to be in equilibrium with that of the money supply. Here at point E, at the interest rate of 6%, the amount of money supply and money demand are equal, which is amounted to 500 billion. Therefore, this means that at 6% of interest rate, the public is content to hold the quantity of money it is actually holding, meaning what people are actually holding is equal to their demand. However, what will happen, say, if the interest rate is, say, adjusted by the National Bank? For instance, it might be increased from 6% to 9%. You see, the demand will be 300 billion. You have to recall the previous slide that we have seen. However, the supply of the money is still there because the supply of money is fixedly supplied by the National Bank. Therefore, while increasing the interest rate from 6% to 9%, the amount of money demand is 300 and the amount of money supply is 500. Therefore, here there is excess of money supply. And this excessity of money supply pushes the interest rate back to 6%. The same reverse happens when the interest rate is decreased to 3%. When the interest rate is decreased to 3%, the amount of money demand will be 800 billion. However, the supply is still the same because it is centrally determined by the National Bank. Therefore, there is an excess demand of 300 for this context. Therefore, people will compete on the existing money and they will compete on the existing limited supply of money, which pushes back its price, which is interest rate that gets back to 6% again. Here is the group exercise. You are critically, you must read these points and you could discuss with your friends as well. Meaning, what is for instance, the effect of the following variables on the money demand, for instance, rise in price level, rise in real income, rise in interest rate, rise in risk of alternative assets, and liquidity of alternative assets. What will be its effect on, what are the factors, and what causes the money supply, and why? Why? For instance, price level. An increase in price level, for instance. What will cause the demand for money? An increase in income. What causes the money demand? And why? An increase in interest rate. What causes the money demand? For instance, it results to fall the money demand. And why? Therefore, all factors are properly summarized here, and you can go through them. Okay, ስለዚህ ምን ፋክተር መኒ ዲማንድን አፌክት እንደሚያደርገው እስካሁን ካየን let's convert the determinant factors into equation, into function. Now we have a theoretical establishment for the money demand. Now let's convert to mathematical form. Therefore, the demand for money function, the money demand function, is equal to price, is a function of price, and the money demand itself, the income, real income or output, and interest rate itself. Therefore, here the money demand is a function of price, income, and interest rate. Therefore, a rise in income increases the money demand. A a rise in interest rate reduces the money demand. And this money demand can be alternatively justified by implicit consideration of the expected rate of inflation. For instance, if there is a rise in the expected interest rate, it will reduce the money demand. And when there is when there is a rise in expected inflation, it will reduce money demand. Why? What will we do is people will convert their money into assets, other form of assets. And we can also convert MD is the nominal money demand. We can convert it into real money demand by adjusting it to the change in price, which is MD over P. Therefore, I hope you understand how the money demand function is being established. Now let's see the elasticities of money demand. We have seen the price, we have seen the income, for instance, and how strong are these factors affecting the money demand? What is the strength? Affect ያደርጋሉ እንጂ ለምሳሌ ኢንካም አፌክት ያደርጋል፣ ኢንተረስት ሬት መኒ ዲማንድን አፌክት ያደርጋል፣ ፕራይስ መኒ ዲማንድን አፌክት ያደርጋል። The question is how strong they are influencing the money demand. We can measure it using the elasticity of money demand. Elasticity, I hope you know the concept. Elasticity is the degree of responsiveness for a change in some specific factor. In this context, elasticity refers the percentage response or the percentage change or the percentage sensitivity change in money demand that comes as a result of a change in income, interest, or price. For instance, what will happen on money demand if real income increases by 1%? If real income increases by 1%, money demand may increase by 2%, it may increase by 0.5%, or it may increase or it might not have a change and equal with 1%. Therefore, when income changes by 1%, and if money demand changes or increases by more than 1%, it is termed as the money demand is elastic for a change in income. And if when there is a change in income by 1%, and if the money demand is below that, therefore the money demand is inelastic for a change in income. And when it is equal, we call it the neutral elasticity. Therefore, we can explain the elasticity with reference to income, for instance, the income elasticity of demand. The higher income increases, these kids in the village are disturbing me with consideration of the buhe, and you may hear some sound. Therefore, income elasticity of money demand. The higher income increases, the money demand. Therefore, there is a positive relationship. And if it is less than 1, I have already explained this one. Meaning, if it is less than 1, higher income increases money demand, less than the proportionate change in income. You can interpret in the same fashion for the rest of the variables, for instance, for interest. And for price as well. If it is equal, we call it monetary. Therefore, the proportional change in price and money demand are equal. The same applies for interest rate and that of income. Okay. Did you hear me? I hope you are with me. Now let's see the asset market equilibrium with the aggregation assumption. Here we have an assumption because we cannot monitor everything with a specific model. Therefore, it's natural to assume in economics. And here, for putting the asset market equilibrium, let's assume that all assets can be grouped into 2 categories. One is the most liquid asset, that's money, and the other is non-monetary asset groups. Here, for the sake of simplicity, we are considering money, which includes the currency and the checking accounts. And these currency and checking accounts pays interest rate denoted with I is the exponent of M. This is to mean that interest rate for money. And here, as I said to you, the money supply is fixed. This is in the short run. Money supply can also be adjusted in the long run. For instance, the National Bank might print money and inject to the economy, right? That printing out of money can result in increasing the money supply in the economy. Therefore, don't assume that money is constant every time. Money supply can also be changed in the long run. Therefore, the supply of money is, in the short run, considered to be fixed at the amount specified as M. And the non-monetary assets, for instance, let's consider stocks, bonds, and land. And the amount of interest rate, is equal to R plus the inflation rate. What does it mean? The nominal interest rate is the summation of the real interest rate and the expected inflation. And the supply of these non-monetary assets is fixed at NM. I hope it is clear how we are framing the equilibrium, right? We are classifying the assets into money and non-monetary assets, and with the respective classification, we put the interest rate and their supply. And now the concern is how the equilibrium can happen for the asset market equilibrium. The asset market equilibrium. It has its own procedure of derivation, which is not really fair. And if you remember, the money demand is defined with, or is a function of income and the amount of interest rate and price. Here, what we are making is, we are dividing M, which is in the above equation, which is denoting the money supply, is M, and you divide it by P. If you remember, in the money demand function, P was here, right? And dividing the M, which is money supply, by P gives you the real money supply. And the right side equation is the real money demand. Therefore, the money market is getting equilibrium at this point. We make it real. We say it real because it is adjusted for inflation. Here is P and pi also in the money demand equation on the right side. And M here is determined by the central bank, in our context, the national bank. And the inflation rate here the inflation rate is closely related to the growth rate of the money supply. Therefore, we can rewrite why it's not displaying here. In the growth rate terms. And if the asset market is in equilibrium, if the asset market is in equilibrium, the inflation rate equals the growth rate of the nominal money supply deducted with the growth rate of real money supply. However, this condition will be fulfilled if the asset market is in equilibrium. Therefore, we can adjust for a change in inflation or a change in price here. The change in price and the change in price would be the equivalent with equal to the change in money supply divided by the money. What we do is we put the change of the respective price, money, and the demand function in general, which is a function of income and that of the interest rate. Therefore, now we could predict inflation. How you predict inflation? You would have to forecast both the money supply, forecasted money supply, and that of the money demand. And the growth rate is reflected with here the change or the delta. And in the long run, we will have the constant interest. And let's consider, or let's simplify this equation, where NY represents the elasticity of money demand with respect to income. Therefore, this equation, the one that I'm putting a cursor, you see here, is replaced by this elasticity of the money demand, which is this, the one that I'm putting a cursor on it. Therefore, finally, what you do is you simplify this equation and write it in the form of inflation, where it is equal to the change in M over M, the change in money supply, minus the elasticity of money times the growth in income. For instance, therefore, countries can estimate the rate of inflation if the following information is given. For instance, the rate of the output, meaning GDP, you can say GDP, per year, the income elasticity demand, and the money supply. Here, the income elasticity of demand is, for instance, it says 2/3, right? Meaning, as income is increasing, money demand is inelastic. And this income elasticity is calculated with the given formula of elasticity, which you remember in your microeconomics, which is not relevant to discuss it here. Therefore, if the national economy, the output is growing 3% per year, and the elasticity of this money demand is 2/3, for instance, and if the money supply is growing, the money supply growth is shown by changing M over N. This tells you the growth rate, right? The growth rate of the money supply. And if you remember in the previous slide, this M stands for the money supply. Therefore, changing M over M is telling you the change in or the growth in money supply. Therefore, if it is given as 10%, therefore, what will be the rate of inflation? What would be the inflation rate for that specific economy within that specific year? What you do is you put 10% minus, you open bracket, 3 times 3% times 2 divided by 3 is 2. Therefore, 10 minus 2 is 8%. I think this is clear, right? 10 ሲቀነስ ኤላስቲ 2/3 ነው። 2/3 ሲባዛ በ3%። ስለዚህ 3ን ታጣፋለች። እዚህ ጋር 10 አለ። 10 ሲቀነስ 2 8 ይመጣል ማለት ነው። Now let's see some empirical evidences on the relationship between money growth and inflation. These are empirical evidences for history, for instance. እነሱ ነው የተሻለ ዳታ ያላቸው እና በትክክል ሊያሳይ የሚችለው ይሄ ነው። You see this one, this is the money growth percent per year, which is changing M over M ያለው እዛ ላይ, and in the y-axis is the inflation rate per year, and you see Belarus, you see there, and here you see Malta. What did you understand from this graph? This graph shows you the linkage between money growth and inflation in those specific countries. And it tells you that inflation is positively associated with money growth. Money growth. Therefore, the question is, why do countries allow money supplies to grow quickly if they assume that it brings inflation? ይሄ ግራፍ የሚያሳያችሁ ምንድነው? መኒ ሳፕላዩ በጣም በጨመረ ቁጥር ይሲ አሁን የመኒ ሳፕላዩ የቤላሩስ ፎር ኢንስታንስ እስከ 160 ይደርሳል። 160 ኢንፍሌሽን ሬቱ ደግሞ እስከ 120% ይሲዚ ሲሆን በጣም መኒ ሳፕላዩ በጨመረ ቁጥር ኢንፍሌሽን ሬቱ በጣም ሃይ ነው ይሆናል ማለት ነው። ኢንፍሌሽን ኦከር ያደርጋል። ስለዚህ እንደዚህ አይነት የሚያስከስት ከሆነ ሀገሮች አንዳንድ ሀገራት ለምንድን ነው መኒ ሳፕላያቸውን የሚያሳድጉት በፍጥነት? if they know that it results in inflation. One of the critical reason is sometimes they might be indebted, so the only option is to print money for financing the government expenditures, for paying for employees, for instance. And this is particularly very practical in countries where there is political turmoil, political crisis and chaos. Therefore, those I know that printing money expands the money supply, which will result in high level of inflation. When countries don't have any option, for instance, in the case of political instabilities or crisis, and when they get unable to pay for their public expenditures, they expand the money supply. So they know that it results in inflation. This is the end. If you have any question, you are welcome. Next Friday, we will see how the banks create money. That is, if you have any question, press the raise hand button. Then I would allow you to unmute for presenting your question. Otherwise, this is the end of the session today. Press the raise your hand button if you have any question. Okay, no question. Okay, thank you very much. See you on Friday.
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ እያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጉታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያድርጉ።